The courtroom went silent when an 8-year-old boy stood up, held out a worn legal pad, and calmly said, "I'd like to speak for my mom." What he did next left even the judge stunned. The courtroom wasn't packed, but you could feel the air shift the moment Jalon Morris stood up. He was 8, maybe 8.5, skinny, brown-skinned, haircut low, backpack still slung over one shoulder like he'd come straight from class. His feet dangled above the floor as he sat next to his mom at the defense table. A tattered legal pad rested on his lap, pages folded and creased like they'd been read over and over. Judge Denise Weller had just called the case, Morris vs. Nance, and asked if the assigned public defender was present. Nobody stood. After a long, uncomfortable pause, the judge sighed and glanced at Tiana Morris, sitting stiff beside her son. "No representation today?" the judge asked, clearly frustrated. Tiana opened her mouth, but no words came. Her hands gripped her knees so tightly her knuckles went pale. She'd been holding on all morning, but now it felt like the floor had given out beneath her. That's when Jalon stood. "Excuse me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Can I say something for my mom?" The room got quiet, not silent like everyone politely listening, quiet like people weren't sure if what they were seeing was real. Judge Weller blinked, caught off guard. "Young man, this isn't really... I just want to say a few things," Jalon added, one hand still on the strap of his backpack. "She didn't do anything wrong, but nobody's here to help her. I've read everything. I know what's going on." There was a beat. Then a soft scoff came from the landlord's attorney, Brent Colson, who whispered something to his client. A bailiff shifted in his seat. Someone in the gallery chuckled under their breath. Jalon didn't flinch. "I brought notes," he said, pulling the legal pad up and flipping it open with a practiced motion. "They said we could get help, but nobody came. I think I can say it the right way now." Judge Weller sat up straighter. "You want to represent your mother?" "I just want to help her just for today. I know I'm not a lawyer." The judge paused, lips pursed, hands resting on the bench. She glanced around the courtroom at the reporter scribbling, the lawyers whispering, the murmurs rippling through the room. She sighed. "Approach the bench, please," she said. "Just you." Jalon walked up, small sneakers squeaking against the polished tile floor. He looked up at the judge without fear, just purpose. Judge Weller leaned forward. "You understand this isn't a game, right?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand this is a legal hearing about whether your mother gets to stay in her home?" "Yes, ma'am. And I've read about the Fair Housing Act and how they gave her notice wrong. They posted it too soon after the complaint. We have proof." There was something about the way he said, "we have proof," that made Judge Weller sit back in her chair. Not smug, not dramatic, just certain, like a kid who knew what he'd seen and didn't want to let anyone lie about it. "You may proceed," she said finally. And just like that, Jalon Morris became the voice of his mother in a court of law. He turned back to the room, walked to the center, and stood beside his mother's chair. Then he began. "On March 12th, my mom told Mr. Nance about the mold in the bathroom. She took pictures. She even wrote a letter and sent it by email. He didn't fix anything. Then 2 weeks later, we got a paper saying we were being evicted for damage to the unit. But we didn't cause the damage. It was already there." He flipped to another page. "Florida Statute 8356 says a landlord has to give written notice in 7 days to fix the problem. But we didn't get a warning. We got a threat." You could hear chairs creak as people leaned forward. Brent Colson scribbled notes. The judge watched, expression unreadable. Jalon kept going, clear, deliberate, like he had practiced this speech a dozen times in front of a mirror or whispered it to himself before bed. "My mom works 2 jobs. She doesn't have time to fight people. But she asked for help, and nobody helped. So I watched videos. I read what I could. I think the law says we should get a chance." He paused, looked at the judge. "Am I allowed to object if something they say isn't true?" That was when the courtroom finally broke, not into laughter, but shock. Audible gasps. Even one of the paralegals whispered, "Oh my God." Judge Weller's lips twitched slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. "You may continue," she said quietly. But before Jalon could say anything else, the room needed to know how things got this far. Tiana Morris didn't grow up imagining she'd be standing in front of a judge with her child next to her, praying someone would see her as more than a case number. She was born in Gulfport, Mississippi, raised mostly by her grandmother after her parents split. Tiana learned early how to hold things together. She got her CNA license by 20, moved to Pensacola a few years later, and had Jalon when she was just 24. Life hadn't given her much, but she made it work. Just her and her boy in a 2-bedroom apartment on West Avery Street, not far from the hospital where she worked the overnight shift. People who knew Tiana wouldn't call her loud or proud. She wasn't the type to raise her voice or draw attention, but she was proud in her own quiet way. Proud that Jalon had never missed a day of school, that he always had clean clothes and knew how to say mom and thank you. Proud that she'd never asked anyone for anything she hadn't tried to earn first. They lived modestly. Her days off were spent doing laundry, picking up extra shifts, or watching reruns with Jalon. No big vacations, no shopping sprees. But she always made sure Jalon had books in his room, pencils sharpened, and lunch money in his bag, even if she skipped her own lunch to make it happen. Then everything started falling apart last winter. It began with a pipe that burst under the kitchen sink. Maintenance came a week later, barely looked, and told her they'd be back. They never came. Soon after, mold crept up behind the cabinets. The bathroom ceiling leaked when it rained, and Jalon started coughing at night. Tiana sent photos, wrote emails, filed complaints, but nothing changed. The apartment wasn't just breaking down, it was turning on them, and the landlord, Gregory Nance, didn't return her calls anymore. When she finally got him on the line, he told her she was being too difficult, and maybe this wasn't the right place for her anymore. That's when she knew he wanted her out. Tiana didn't have savings. She barely kept up with rent. But what she had was proof. Photos, messages, every date written down in a cheap spiral notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. She filed a complaint with the city. But while that was processing, Nance moved first. An eviction notice showed up taped to her front door on a Tuesday morning. Jalon saw it before she did. He held the paper in his hands, staring at it, quiet. Tiana grabbed it, skimmed it, and sat on the arm of the couch like someone had punched her in the chest. "We didn't do anything," Jalon said softly. She couldn't answer him. She contacted legal aid, waited 3 weeks for a response. They gave her a public defender, a young man who seemed nice, but buried, barely keeping his head above water. Tiana met him once on the phone. He told her eviction court was quick. "Don't worry too much. Bring what you have. Someone would be there." She didn't feel reassured, but she didn't know what else to do. Meanwhile, Jalon was paying attention. He watched her every night, sitting at the dining table, trying to make sense of the lease, Googling legal terms on her cracked phone. She thought he was just coloring or doing homework at the other end of the table, but he was listening, always listening. She'd find scribbled notes in his notebooks, words like statute, tenant rights, mold clause. She didn't say anything. She figured it was just his way of trying to understand what was going on. Kids noticed more than we think, but she never imagined what he was really doing. She had no idea he was studying. The night before court, she barely slept. She laid out Jalon's school clothes like normal, packed his lunch. She figured the case would be postponed, or maybe the lawyer would finally show and speak for her. She didn't want to bring Jalon to the courthouse, but her neighbor canceled last minute, and she couldn't miss the hearing, so she brought him with her. They sat in the courtroom side by side as the minutes crawled. Tiana tried to look calm, but her hands were slick with sweat. When the judge called her name, and no one else stood up, she thought, "This is it. I'm alone." And then, before she could move, Jalon stood up beside her. But things hadn't just gotten bad overnight. The apartment they lived in had started falling apart long before eviction was ever mentioned. They moved into the unit on West Avery Street 3 years earlier. It wasn't perfect, but it was decent. Neutral carpet, chipped baseboards, noisy plumbing, nothing Tiana hadn't seen before. It was all she could afford, and the location worked. Close to Jalon's school, close to Sacred Hope Medical Center, where she worked the graveyard shift. At first, the landlord, Gregory Nance, had been professional enough, not warm, not friendly, but he answered the phone and fixed what he needed to fix. That changed after the second year. The little issues stopped being little. The refrigerator made a loud ticking sound that kept Jalon up at night. The window in the back bedroom wouldn't close all the way. The water heater acted up every few weeks. When Tiana called, she got voicemail. When she emailed, she got no response. When she went in person to the management office, a new assistant told her Mr. Nance was busy this week, so she started documenting everything. She kept a dated log on paper, every call, every unanswered email. She saved photos on her phone. She even took a video of the leaky ceiling over the tub, where water dripped steadily from a crack in the plaster. Jalon would shower while she stood guard with a mop nearby. One night, the toilet backed up and flooded the bathroom. It took 5 hours to get someone to respond. The next day, the drywall near the baseboards was already peeling. Jalon was coughing more by then, especially at night. Tiana worried it was the mold. She tried to clean it with vinegar and baking soda because she couldn't afford anything stronger, but it kept coming back. Black streaks around the tub, behind the fridge, in the closet near Jalon's shoes. Still, she paid rent on time every month. She didn't want to give Nance any excuse to say she was late. The final straw came after she filed a complaint with the Pensacola Housing Code Enforcement Office, quietly. She didn't announce it. She didn't confront him. She just followed the process. That's when Nance changed completely. He stopped returning calls altogether. A few days later, someone left a notice on her door claiming she had violated terms of the lease. The reason? Excessive damage to property. She stood outside with the paper in her hand and just stared at it. Jalon was at school. She didn't know whether to scream or cry. She just felt small. She'd done everything right. And still, this man had the power to take away the only home her son had ever known. When she tried calling the office again, no answer. She emailed, no reply. A week later, she received an official eviction letter. Jalon saw her crying that night. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat across from her at the table while she stared down at the letter. Then he slid his math book aside and looked her in the eye. "Are we going to be okay?" She smiled without showing teeth. "Of course we are." "You're lying," he said, not with anger, just certainty. She laughed a little. "I'm trying not to." He nodded, then pulled his notebook closer. "I don't think he's allowed to do this. I read that they have to give you a chance to fix things first." She blinked. "You read what?" "I was just looking online. I saw a video about renters' rights. It said something about how they have to send you a letter before eviction and give you time to fix whatever they're mad about." She didn't know what to say. That night, long after he went to bed, she picked up his notebook and flipped through the pages. They were filled with notes, not schoolwork, but observations, quotes from websites, references to laws. 7-day notice required by statute. No retaliation for reporting issues. Mold is health hazard. Her son had been reading law. She should have told him to stop, to let her handle it, but a part of her felt something shift. Jalon had always been sharp. He caught on quick, spoke clearly, asked good questions. But this was different. She didn't know it yet, but he was preparing. Preparing for the moment someone would try to silence them, preparing to speak up when she no longer had the strength to. But before that moment came, the legal system would have to show just how little it cared about the people falling through its cracks. The day the official eviction notice arrived, it wasn't the paper that scared Tiana. It was how quiet it was. No knock, no doorbell, just a sheet of paper taped at eye level, flapping slightly in the wind. She found it coming home from her overnight shift. The sun already high, sweat gathering under her scrubs. Jalon was at school. Her keys dropped before she even realized she'd let go of them. She pulled the notice off the door and read it once, then again. Legal terms, deadlines, court date, violation of lease due to tenant-caused damage. No mention of her complaints, the mold, the broken sink, the ignored maintenance logs. She slid down onto the front steps, elbows on her knees. She was exhausted, not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, something heavier. She tried calling the housing office. The person who answered said, "We can't offer legal advice." She hung up before she cried on the line. That afternoon, she made 5 more calls, left 5 more voicemails, and then she sat at the kitchen table, pulled out her notebook, and flipped to the next clean page. Date, time, eviction notice received, no prior written warning. She circled that last part 3 times. Jalon came home to the smell of microwave pizza and the sound of her typing. He dropped his backpack and walked straight to the table. "They gave us the paper, didn't they?" She paused. Yeah. He sat beside her, pulling out his own folder of papers. They can't just kick us out. She reached over and rubbed his back. We're not going anywhere. But he didn't believe that, and neither did she. Over the next week, things moved fast. She was assigned a public defender, Brian Quintero, who worked out of a satellite office behind a DMV near Brent Lane. He called her 3 days before the hearing, voice clipped and distracted. I've got your paperwork. You'll need to bring everything to court. Lease, photos, complaints, anything you have documented. Will you be there? She asked. Should be. But in case I'm tied up with another hearing, just tell the judge you're waiting on counsel. They'll understand. She hung up, feeling like she was already losing. She gathered everything. Printed emails, time-stamped photos, maintenance logs, even the mold swabs she'd taken with Jalon's science kit. Everything went into a plastic file folder. She labeled each tab in black marker. Jalon watched from the other end of the table, flipping through his own notes. They're going to try to say it's your fault, he said calmly. I know. Do you have the lease? Yes. EK, did you highlight where it talks about repairs? She looked up. Jalon, baby, you don't have to. I just want to make sure. She sighed, then slid the lease across to him. He flipped to the middle, ran his finger down the page. Right here, Section 5. It says the landlord has to maintain a habitable residence, including running water, plumbing, and protection from mold or mildew. That means they were supposed to fix it. She smiled in spite of herself. You really read all this? He shrugged. I couldn't sleep. They spent that night organizing. Jalon made sticky notes for each photo. He arranged the papers by date. When Tiana asked why he was doing all this, he just said, You need help. I'm here. She kissed his forehead. You're my little lawyer now. He grinned. Call me junior attorney. The morning of the hearing, Tiana dressed in her best outfit. Black slacks, a navy blouse, flats. Jalon wore his school uniform, khakis, and a white polo. His shoes were polished, hair freshly brushed. They took the bus downtown. Neither spoke much. Inside the courthouse, it smelled like floor cleaner and paperwork. People shuffled in and out of rooms with tired eyes, and folders clutched to their chests. Some alone, some in pairs, some with babies in strollers. Courtroom 2B was nearly full when they entered. They found a seat near the front. Jalon sat close, eyes scanning the room. Tiana kept glancing at the door, hoping to see her lawyer walk in. He never did. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Jalon stood tall like he knew what it meant. Tiana tried to quiet the pounding in her chest. Then the cases began. People went up, spoke quickly, sat back down. Some cried, some got angry. It moved fast. When the clerk called Morris v. Nance, Tiana stood. So did Jalon. The judge looked around. Representation for the defendant. Silent. Tiana opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Then Jalon gently cleared his throat and said, Can I say something for my mom? But this time, it wasn't just about being heard. It was about fighting back. Jalon had always been a quiet kid, not shy, just observant. He was the type who didn't interrupt, didn't blurt things out. He watched, absorbed, asked thoughtful questions. Teachers said he was mature for his age. Tiana knew better. He wasn't mature. He just carried more than most kids ever had to. The day the eviction notice came, something switched in him. He didn't ask if they were moving. He didn't cry or panic. He sat down, opened one of his school notebooks, and started writing. That's when it began. While Tiana stressed over calls and paperwork, Jalon was reading. When she went to work, he'd sit at her old laptop and watch hours of legal advice on YouTube, tenant rights, court procedures, lease agreements. He didn't understand every word, but he got the rhythm. He picked up on patterns, terms like constructive eviction and retaliatory notice. He didn't tell his mom. He didn't want to worry her. She was already holding on by a thread. But every night after dinner, after dishes, after the news, he would take the legal pad she kept in the kitchen drawer and copy notes he had memorized earlier that day. Sometimes he stayed up late with a flashlight under his blanket, whispering lines to himself until he could say them without blinking. He wasn't playing lawyer. He was preparing for war. The apartment became their courtroom. Jalon would pretend to be the judge, reading out questions from the documents. Mrs. Morris, When did you first notify your landlord about the mold? Tiana would smile and say, "Boy, stop." But he kept at it. He practiced objections, rehearsed responses. He even printed out a picture of the Florida State Capitol building and taped it above his desk like it was a vision board. Still, Tiana didn't see the full picture. She knew he was smart, knew he was invested, but she thought he was just trying to understand what they were going through. She didn't realize he was preparing to do something about it. That moment came during a Sunday visit to the local library. They had gone to print some of her court documents, but the system was down. Jalon wandered into the non-fiction section and pulled a book from the shelf. Your Rights as a Renter in Florida. It was older, but when he opened it, he saw the same words he'd heard in the videos. He started highlighting passages with sticky notes. By the time they left, he had 4 pages copied by hand and a list of statutes written in the margins of his notebook. Tiana asked what he was doing. Making a cheat sheet. For what? In case you need help talking in court. She ruffled his hair. That's sweet, baby, but the lawyer will do that. Jalon didn't answer. He knew better. The night before the hearing, Tiana fell asleep at the table. Her head rested against a stack of papers. Jalon tiptoed around the room, gently pulling documents from her hands, organizing them into folders. He labeled everything. He even used colored tabs to match the timeline he had memorized. He whispered to himself as he worked. March 12th, complaint submitted. March 15th, email with photos. March 20th, mold spreads. March 27th, retaliatory eviction notice. He cross-referenced everything against the Florida statute numbers he had scribbled into the back of his math book. When he finished, he stacked everything neatly and laid his uniform out on the chair. He didn't sleep much. He just stared at the ceiling, wondering what would happen if he didn't speak up. He thought about their apartment, his books, the hand-drawn solar system taped to his wall, the creaky old fan above his bed, and his mom trying so hard every day to pretend she wasn't afraid. By sunrise, he had made his decision. He wasn't going to sit there and watch them lose everything. He was going to speak. But even with all his quiet preparation, Jalon had no idea what kind of storm he was about to walk into inside that courtroom. It was just after 9 a.m. when they stepped into Escambia County Courthouse, room 2B. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, and the room smelled faintly of paper and old coffee. Tiana held her folder against her chest like armor. Jalon carried his school backpack in one hand and the legal pad in the other. They found seats in the second row, not too close to the front. Tiana didn't want attention, but not in the back either. She wanted the judge to see her, hear her. She didn't know it yet, but that spotlight was about to shift. The clerk read names. People shuffled forward, their cases taking minutes, sometimes seconds. A man in a neon orange hoodie walked out, visibly upset. A young woman with a baby on her hip sobbed as the judge delivered a ruling. It was fast, unforgiving, like a machine chewing through names. Jalon sat still, eyes moving. He watched every lawyer, every word, every pause. Then came the words, Morris Veers Nance. Tiana stood, heart hammering. She looked to the side, expecting to see her court-appointed lawyer slip in at the last second. He wasn't there. Judge Weller glanced around. Representation for Miss Morris? No response. Tiana opened her mouth, tried to say, "He's supposed to be here." But nothing came out. Her voice caught in her throat. Jalon stood before she could. "Your Honor," he said, stepping forward, his legal pad tucked close. "Can I say something for my mom?" The judge blinked. "Excuse me?" "I want to speak on her behalf, just today." Tiana reached for him. "Jalon, baby, sit down." He didn't. The bailiff looked confused. The clerk looked amused. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. The landlord's attorney, Brent Coulson, smirked and leaned toward his client, whispering something no one else heard. Jalon didn't move. He just looked at the judge like this was normal, like this was something kids did all the time. "I've read everything," he said calmly. "I understand the timeline. I know what she's being accused of. I think I can explain what really happened." Judge Weller folded her hands. "How old are you?" 8, but I'm almost 9. That drew a louder laugh from somewhere in the back. Jalon didn't blink. "Your Honor," he continued, "we don't have anyone else. My mom didn't do anything wrong. She asked for help. Nobody came. I just want to say what I know. The judge leaned back slowly, scanning the room. Then she said, "Approach the bench." Jalon stepped forward, sneakers quiet on the tile. He stood straight, eyes level with the top of the desk. She bent forward, voice low. "Do you know what a hearing is?" "Yes, ma'am. I know this is real. I'm not pretending." "And what would you say if I let you speak?" "I'd start with the dates, then the pictures, then the lease terms, then I'd talk about the repairs that never happened." Judge Weller looked at him for a long time. Then, to everyone's surprise, she said, "Go ahead." Jalon turned, walked back to where his mom stood frozen, and positioned himself next to her. He looked at the judge. "My name is Jalon Morris," he said, projecting louder. "Now, I'm here to speak for my mom because nobody else showed up to do it." He opened the legal pad. On March 12th, she emailed the property office about the mold in our kitchen. On March 14th, they replied saying they'd send someone. No one came. On March 20th, the leak got worse. I recorded a video of the water coming through the ceiling. We still have it on her phone. He flipped the page. Then on March 27th, we got a notice saying we were being evicted because we caused the damage. But that's not true. We told them before it got bad. We have proof. His voice didn't shake. He didn't rush. He sounded more like a junior attorney than a scared child. His mom stood beside him, jaw slack. Jalon continued, referencing specific clauses in the lease agreement and even citing Florida Statute 83-51, which requires landlords to maintain a livable property. He pointed out how the timeline of events didn't line up, how the landlord failed to act, and how the notice was issued in retaliation. When Brent Colson objected, Judge Weller raised a hand. "Let him finish." Jalon looked at her and asked, "Am I allowed to object if something they say isn't true?" A hush fell across the courtroom. Not mockery, not disbelief, just silence, pure stillness. It felt like everyone forgot to breathe. Judge Weller let out a slow exhale. "Yes," she said softly, "you may continue." But what Jalon said next would shift more than just the court's mood. It would change the entire tone of the case. Jalon didn't pace. He didn't wave his arms or dramatize anything. He stood still, one hand gripping the edge of the legal pad, while the other flipped each page carefully, like the way his teacher told him to handle library books. Every sentence he spoke sounded like he had already said it 10 times in his head before opening his mouth. He continued, "My mom didn't get the 7-day notice the lease talks about. They just gave her the eviction. We didn't get time to fix anything even though she asked. I wrote down everything in the order it happened." Judge Weller leaned forward slightly, elbow on her bench, her finger tapping her chin. She wasn't just listening, she was analyzing. The courtroom had gone completely quiet. Even Brent Colson had stopped taking notes. The only sound was Jalon turning his next page. "There's also a law about mold," Jalon said, looking up. "I wrote it down here. It says landlords have to make sure the unit is safe and that they can't retaliate if you complain. But my mom did report it, and we have the emails." He held up a printout, photos taped to the back of a grocery store receipt. The timestamps were still visible, mold around the bathtub, water pooling in the ceiling. A close-up of Jalon's shoes with green spots on the sole. Colson finally stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this child is..." But before he could finish, Jalon said, "That's the man who said we broke the apartment, but we didn't. It was already like that. He never fixed it." Colson raised a brow. "Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court this is an informal presentation. There is no sworn testimony." "And Mr. Colson," Judge Weller cut in, "you'll get your turn." Colson sat down slowly. Jalon returned to his notes. "My mom doesn't yell at people. She doesn't fight. She just works. Sometimes she works all night and still makes me pancakes before school. She called the number in the lease 3 times. Nobody ever came. I remember because she wrote the date on the calendar. I still have it in my room." He paused there, not because he forgot, but because he felt something heavy behind his words. "She cried when she got that letter. I heard her. She never cries." Tiana looked down at her hands, eyes glassy. Jalon took a breath. "I think if we had a lawyer, he would have said this better. But nobody came, so I had to do it because she didn't do anything wrong. She just wanted someone to fix the mold and they're trying to kick us out." He closed the legal pad. That was it. No grand ending, no mic drop. Just a little boy standing in a courtroom trying to stop his world from collapsing. Judge Weller didn't speak right away. She looked at Tiana, who had said nothing during the entire hearing. Then at Coulson, who looked more annoyed than confident now. Then back at Jalon, who stood as if awaiting instructions. "Do you have the documents you mentioned?" she asked him. Jalon nodded and handed over a small, neatly labeled folder. He had separated each section with handwritten tabs, emails, lease, photos, notes. She took it without comment. The room stayed still for a moment longer before Judge Weller cleared her throat. "I'm calling a recess. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. The gavel tapped once. As she stood to leave, Judge Weller said nothing to the bailiff, nothing to the lawyers. Just one thing to Jalon as she passed the defense table. "You were heard." Jalon looked at his mom, unsure of what that meant, but Tiana's hand reached for his, gripping it tightly. Outside the courtroom, people were whispering. A reporter near the door scribbled notes furiously. Someone from the gallery was already on the phone. Jalon didn't notice any of it. He just reached into his backpack and pulled out a peanut butter sandwich. "I'm hungry," he said, voice flat like nothing unusual had just happened. Tiana laughed for the first time in days, but as they waited for the judge to return, they had no idea the outside world was already reacting to what had just happened inside that room. By the time they stepped back into the courtroom, the energy had changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in how people looked at them. A man from the gallery gave Tiana a respectful nod as they passed. Another woman whispered to her seatmate, eyes locked on Jalon like he was someone you'd already seen on the news. The clerk re-entered and called the court back into session. Judge Weller returned to the bench with a small stack of papers in her hand, Jalon's folder among them. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at both parties, and addressed the room. "I've reviewed the materials submitted by the Morris family. I've also taken note of the defendant's absence of counsel this morning and the effort made to proceed regardless." She didn't smile, but her tone had softened. "Mr. Coulson, do you have anything to submit before we continue?" Coulson stood, visibly flustered now. "Your Honor, while I acknowledge the child's effort, I must emphasize that this is an eviction case based on physical damage to the property. Whether or not repairs were delayed, the photographs suggest an environment that violates basic housing conditions, conditions that, according to my client, were exacerbated by neglect." "Do you have dated maintenance records?" the judge asked. Coulson hesitated. "Not at this time." "No warning letters?" He cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor." Judge Weller flipped through the folder again. "Then I will consider the timeline presented by the Morris family as credible, especially given the landlord's failure to respond to formal complaints prior to filing the eviction." That was it. No fanfare, no dramatic speech, just logic, facts, evidence. Coulson sat down without a word. Then came a brief, rustling sound. Papers shifting, shoes scuffing the floor, muffled coughs. Jalon sat perfectly still. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at his mother, whose hands were now folded in her lap, clenched so tightly her fingernails left marks in her skin. Judge Weller continued. "Due to the lack of sufficient documentation from the plaintiff, the court finds no grounds to support the claim of tenant-caused damage. The eviction notice is hereby dismissed." It took a full second before the room reacted. Not everyone clapped, but enough did. Two women in the gallery let out soft cheers. One man gave a quiet whistle. A deputy near the door raised his eyebrows. Jalon didn't move. Tiana put a hand over her mouth and whispered, "We won." He nodded. "You did." Judge Weller looked directly at Jalon. "Mr. Morris," Jalon looked up. "I don't believe I've ever had someone your age speak in this courtroom the way you did today. That took courage and preparation. You should be proud." He nodded again, still calm, still composed, but his hand reached under the table and grabbed his mom's. He didn't let go. After court adjourned, things moved quickly. People approached them, strangers with questions, others offering handshakes, even a young woman from a local nonprofit asking for their contact info. Jalon seemed overwhelmed but polite, his mouth pressed into a thin line as he answered every, "How old are you?" and "Where'd you learn all that?" with the same quiet response, "I just paid attention." Tiana, still processing everything, barely noticed the man holding a camera outside the courthouse. "Can we get a quick interview?" he asked. "Just a few words." Jalon hesitated. Tiana started to decline, but Jalon said, "Okay." The reporter crouched a little to get on his level. "What made you decide to speak for your mom today?" Jalon looked at his mother first, then back at the reporter, because nobody else was going to. That clip aired on the 6 News. Within hours, it hit social media. By the next morning, Jalon Morris was trending on Twitter. Local news turned national. National turned global. Suddenly, lawyers were offering to represent them pro bono. Community organizers reached out. Housing advocates began quoting Jalon's line in rallies and articles. Nobody else was going to. He didn't care about any of it. All he wanted was to go home, sit on the couch, and eat dinner with his mom, without wondering if someone was going to knock and tell them to leave. But outside their apartment door, a much bigger conversation was just getting started, and Jalon's name was now part of it. In the days that followed, what happened inside courtroom 2B didn't just stay in Florida. It lit a fuse. Local news outlets picked up the story first, showing a grainy clip of Jalon's closing line. "She didn't do anything wrong. She just didn't have a lawyer. But I'm here." That 30 seconds was enough. Within 48 hours, national networks were running it on repeat. Morning shows, legal podcasts, op-ed columns. Everyone wanted to talk about the little boy who stood up in court and flipped a whole eviction case upside down. But while the world reacted with awe, something else happened too. People began asking why this had to happen in the first place. Why had a mother with a legitimate complaint been brushed off for months? Why was her case handed to a public defender juggling dozens of files with no time to read hers? Why did it take an 8-year-old to get a judge's attention? These weren't just questions, they were accusations. Quiet ones at first, then louder. Then, by the end of the week, the Pensacola Legal Aid Office was flooded with angry emails from viewers across the country. Some were sympathetic, others furious. How could you let her stand there alone? Do you even read your client's files? One local representative called for an audit into eviction handling procedures in low-income housing. Gregory Nance, the landlord, suddenly had a spotlight he didn't ask for. His name made it into headlines, and his voicemail was full of angry messages. A few tenants from other properties came forward with similar stories, repairs ignored, notices handed out instead of solutions. One woman posted photos of her own bathroom ceiling, nearly identical to the ones Jalon had shown in court. The judge's ruling didn't set new law, but it set a tone. People were no longer just looking at Tiana's case. They were examining a system. Jalon and his mother stayed mostly quiet through it all. They turned down most interviews. Tiana didn't like being on camera, and Jalon wasn't interested in going viral. "I'm not a lawyer," he told one reporter. "I just didn't want us to lose our home." That simple truth carried more weight than any headline ever could. Behind the scenes, change began to stir. A local attorney named Melinda Charles reached out to offer full representation for Tiana. She reviewed the lease, the complaint history, even walked through their apartment herself. "This isn't a one-time thing," she told them after that visit. "What happened to you is happening all over this city." Tiana nodded. "But most people don't have a Jalon." Melinda helped them submit formal complaints to the housing board and filed a motion requesting damages for breach of contract and emotional distress. The paperwork alone took 2 weeks, but for once, Tiana didn't have to carry it all herself. Jalon sat in the background through most of it, quietly watching again, just like before. Except this time, people were watching him. School was strange for a while. Teachers congratulated him in front of the class. Other kids asked if he was going to be on TV again. One student made a joke that stung. Something about Jalon pretending to be grown. He didn't respond. He just went back to writing in his notebook. He hadn't done it for attention. He'd done it because he didn't want to watch his mother be silenced. And even though they'd won that first hearing, he knew the system hadn't suddenly fixed itself. People were still being evicted. Families were still being ignored. Landlords were still choosing threats over repairs. What he did caused a crack in the wall, but the wall was still there. Still, cracks let light in. A week later, Tiana received a call from a regional housing advocate asking if she would be willing to speak at a panel for tenant rights reform. She hesitated. "I'm not really that type of person," she said. "I don't like microphones." But Jalon asked her to say yes. "You don't have to be the loudest," he told her. "You just have to be the one who shows up." So she agreed. They sat together at the event, Tiana clutching her notes. Jalon in a clean white polo, the same kind he wore in court. She didn't say much, just told her story. What it felt like to be ignored, what it meant to be heard, and what it meant to have your child step in when nobody else would. When she finished, the room stood to applaud. She wasn't used to that, but she smiled anyway. But even as the applause faded, one more question still remained. What comes next for a boy who defended his mother better than most lawyers ever could? The noise died down eventually. The headlines faded. The hashtag stopped trending. Jalon Morris was no longer the boy in the courtroom, at least not in the public's eye. But for those who knew him, for those who lived in that worn-down apartment on West Avery Street, nothing really went back to the way it was, and that was okay. A few weeks after the hearing, their mailbox held something new. A letter from the landlord's attorney. It was thin. No eviction notice. Just a formal statement that the property owner Gregory Nance would not pursue further legal action, and that the Morris family was free to remain in the unit until their lease expired. It read cold, but the message was clear. They had backed off, but staying wasn't what Tiana wanted anymore. The fight had changed her. Not just the hearing, but the way her son had looked at her through it all. Like he'd known she was worth standing up for, even when she wasn't sure herself. That kind of clarity doesn't leave you unchanged. So, she called Melinda Charles, the attorney who had helped them post-trial, and asked for advice on applying for rental assistance and housing relocation programs. Melinda connected her with a local program that worked with hospital staff, offering subsidized rent for essential workers. They moved 2 months later, a small 2-bedroom on Coral Hill Lane, new paint, working locks, a dryer that didn't have to be kicked twice before it turned on. Jalon got his own desk. Tiana got a bathtub that didn't leak. Their old apartment, someone else moved in. Probably another family with stories. Probably another mother trying to juggle everything with a smile. Tiana didn't look back. Jalon started 5th grade that fall. Nothing about him looked different, but everything about him was. He wasn't louder. He wasn't showier. He was still the same kid who raised his hand when he had something to say. But now people listened when he spoke. At school, one of his teachers invited a guest from a local legal nonprofit to speak about tenant rights. Jalon listened quietly from the back, then approached afterward and thanked the man for explaining things so clearly. The guest blinked when Jalon introduced himself. "Wait, you're that Jalon?" Jalon just smiled and said, "Yeah, but I like math more." A few nights later, while Tiana was finishing up dishes, Jalon stood in the kitchen doorway holding his folder, the same one he used in court. "Can I throw this out now?" he asked. She wiped her hands and walked over. Flipping through the folder slowly, she saw his notes again. The tabs, the quotes, the dates written in his small, neat handwriting. She paused at one page, the words, "Nobody else was going to," underlined twice. She didn't answer right away. "Keep it," she said finally. "Not because we need it anymore, but because one day when someone else needs help, you'll remember what you're capable of." Jalon nodded and tucked it back in his backpack. Later that evening, they sat on the couch, dinner plates cleared, cartoons playing low. Jalon leaned against her, legs pulled up, and asked a question she hadn't expected. "Do you think I could ever be a lawyer?" She turned to look at him. "You already were one," she said. "You just didn't get paid." He laughed. She laughed too. And that was the first time in a long time that things felt light. Not perfect, but lighter. The experience hadn't made them rich. It hadn't brought justice to every other family fighting a battle like theirs. But it gave them something real. Dignity. The kind that can't be given by a system or a judge or a trending headline. The kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground and told the truth. Jalon didn't need the world's applause. He just needed a place where he and his mom could sit in peace, with the front door locked and nobody trying to take it from them. And he got that. In the end, the lesson wasn't just about law, or housing, or courtrooms. It was about love, about showing up when it matters, about being small in a room full of adults and deciding to speak anyway, and about remembering that silence only wins when no one dares to interrupt it. So the next time someone tells you a child can't understand what's going on, think of Jalon Morris, because when everyone else sat quiet, He raised his hand and changed everything.